Hi, everyone. This is Doug. This is going to be the continuation of our series, short one, called Top 4 Most Popular JWO Videos in 2023. We're going to take highlights and excerpts. So these were the most popular, the most viewed, and they rank the highest. And I'll show you the ranking here in a second. There it is. So the top 4 we've already seen. We looked at the bottom one here, Pagan Christology of Paul, Galatians 1:12. Now we're on the episode, Did the 12 find Paul was a false apostle? And this incidentally had 111 likes, far more than the one below that, which was 77. And it had 44 subscribers that came of that video. So a lot of people have seen it, but a lot of people since then have not seen it. It's been almost a year since this first came out. By the way, I'm doing this because I have a legal brief coming up in a week, and I have to focus my attention on that. It's a trial, post-trial motions that are going on. Anyway, so hopefully this will give you, if you haven't seen this before, this will give you a little bit of a catch-up on what has been on the channel before and others found very useful. All right, so here is the excerpts from that video number 3 on the list here. Did the 12 find Paul was a false apostle? This is the face sheet, and it was entitled, by the way, here it is, Did the 12 find Paul was a false apostle? Did Pauline Christians alter Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose of Milan, to delete the reason? So he explains that the 12 found Paul a false apostle, and he says this in his commentary in Corinthians. This is a work he wrote in the 380 AD period, and he said it, though, that even though the apostles found him to be a false apostle, the Corinthians saw the signs and wonders and accepted Paul as an apostle. So he's not anti-Paul. He's just telling you the fact of life. Okay, so let's now return to that video from last year, and we'll come back at the end and sign off later. Hi, everyone. In this episode, we're going to ask the question, did the 12 find Paul was a false apostle? And this is going to be episode 3 in our series, What I Would Tell a Pauline Christian to Bring Them to Treat All of Jesus' Words are Not Only Binding Now, but Also He is Our Sole Teacher. However, we're also going to use this episode as a further example of chicanery of people who are defending Paul by using illegitimate means, likely. And we're going to ask some assistance from those out there who might live near Stanford University to help us make this even more conclusive than it is already, but it is highly proven already, but we'll go on. So the question is there a chicanery to suppress Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, or now later after Erasmus raised doubts, they call him Ambrosiaster? Is there any chicanery to suppress Ambrosiaster's full statement about the 12 found Paul a false apostle? So is there some detail or material that's being omitted so we can't understand why they held him to be a false apostle? So let's go on. So here is the first book where he mentions it, and he's doing a running commentary on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and he's pulling in different people who give different quotes. So on 9:2, he'll find several people who give different quotes. So he's assembling sort of what we call an e-catena, a chain of commentary, running commentary from many people on many authoritative commentators on the same verse. So he's not trying to quote the entire context of the 1 Corinthians commentary by Ambrosiaster, but just pulling out this one quote. So it's the same thing I just read you. We'll just read it one more time so you hear it. 9:2, 1 Corinthians 9:2. An apostle to the Corinthians, the Ambrosiaster. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continue to observe the law of Moses deny that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles, the 12, thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they, the 12, denied that he was an apostle. I'm adding that in so we get the they in significance. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him. Now, it's very clear when you read the full context of the commentary of Ambrose, or Ambrosiaster if you prefer, he's clearly pro-Paul, and he's saying this in a way of putting some bad news that people obviously knew about in the best light possible, which means the news must have been so well known that this was necessary to help assuage or downplay that news. But to us in the 21st century, we've never even heard that Paul was declared a false apostle by the 12. So this has got to be astonishing information to us. Well, this message here has been systematically destroyed wherever else it appeared. But this one passage was overlooked, in my opinion, or they felt, he's excusing it. But now we're going to find out this is not the whole passage. So there's something being left out. So the same gentleman, Mr. Bray, writes a book 9 years later. So this book here is the first one I showed you, first to 1 and 2 Corinthians is written by or edited by Gerald Bray, 1999. And now he's going to write an entire book focused just on Ambrose the Aster. That one little quote inspired him maybe to do a whole thing where he's going to now do the full commentary in 1 Corinthians. And he writes this in the year 2009. It's IVP, InterVarsity Press Academic. So we're talking about people who know their stuff. And this is the first, he says, well, let me just show you. This is how it's advertised. Corinthian correspondence are made available in English in English translation for the first time. That's basically what it's saying there. And I think that says it again here. And then 12 editions were published between 2009 and 2013 in English. So this is the first time a complete translation in English was ever made in 2009 of Ambrose or Ambrose the Aster's work of the commentary of 1 Corinthians. Hard to believe with everything we publish all the time. And this is a very detailed verse by verse exposition. So it's very interesting that it was ignored until now. But Bray resurrects it, takes it out of the dust. So since 2009 to what? Today is 2023. So we're talking about 14 years. It's been out 14 years and nobody has ever commented on this. Let's continue. All right. So here is now in this book. This is where he's going to do it again. Was he going to repeat what he did in his prior book, the book we showed you earlier, which was this book? Is he going to do it again? Yes, he's going to do the exact same thing with the exact same site. I'll read it one more time. So we then showed you what he said in his own first book, where it was just a snippet quote. And now we're going to show you what's in his book as his entire translation of all of this commentary of Ambrose or Ambrose the Aster. He says, to read again, those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they, the other apostles, denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, because he was an apostle, because they had seen the signs of God's powers in him, they accepted him as an apostle. And now I want to now show you, though, I found a Latin source for this and a very reliable Latin source as it goes. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so now I'm going to read you the version that I found in a Latin text, and I'll show you what it is. It's called Patriologiae, Paris, 1879 by J.P. Mignet. He was the editor. He was a well-known editor. I want to just show you ahead of do a quick thing. There is a Wikipedia article, Patrologia Latina. We're going to get to that later. All right, so here's what it actually says in the Latin text that the only Latin text we can find. Here's what it says. It first quotes 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. Although I am not an apostle to others, yet I am to you. And here's Ambrose or Ambrose the Aster's comments. Because by the Jews who believed and nevertheless kept the law, he was denied to be an apostle, for he was already teaching that the circumcised, meaning I think he means to say that the circumcision should not be observed, that circumcision should not be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept, but to the rest of the apostles who because of the scandal concealed or hid themselves from this matter, he seemed to teach differently. Therefore, the apostle, meaning Paul, was denied by them. For to these, i.e. the Corinthians, he was an apostle, for from him they had seen him, Paul, do signs of virtue. And then it goes back to another quote of Paul. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, says Paul, for by preaching this, they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. So the two things that are new or different from the translation that are significant, there's minor changes too, that Mr. Bray had he did not include the words because of the scandal. These apostles, the 12, hid themselves from this matter, or concealed themselves. And that's important because that will tie into something that he says in Galatians 2, verse 11. The same person, Ambrose is going to say that was a scandal, what happened in Galatians 2:11. You see, using the same terminology. So that appears to be what he's cross-referencing, maybe in his own brain, or expects the audience listening has it already in their own mind, that it must be something well known that there was a scandal between Peter and the 11 against Paul, and Paul against them. So, and Paul's shameless about it, by the way, in Galatians. And he tries to act like he's the superior one and the superiorly righteous person. And Peter is a hypocrite for withdrawing eating with Gentiles when James's representatives show up to see what's going on in Antioch, where Paul is eating, obviously, meat. And in that area, that region, every piece of meat is going to be sacrificed to idols, because you can't buy meat in the marketplace in any of those kind of cities in those territories that haven't been sacrificed to the idols first, so that they would be blessed. So that's how, in fact, it was considered, like immoral to eat meat that didn't get blessed in that way. And so, but Paul said that's okay. You can eat meat sacrificed to idols. He said that in 1 Corinthians 8. So that's the core reason there's a conflict. And Paul interpreted what Peter was doing was wrong, withdrawing from eating with them in that situation. And that, of course, would not be wrong. That was mandated in Acts 15. And Jesus in Revelation 2 says you can't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So there's a lot of two sides of this debate, but you can see Ambrose is seeing it only from Paul's side, and he's making them look shamed that this scandal was a scandal against Peter, not a scandal involving Paul. Paul should have the scandal on him because he's acting superior to someone who's in fact superior to him. He's the apostle who Jesus said, upon this rock I'm going to build my church. I mean, he's a foundation of the church. He's a leader, clearly, of the church without office, meaning he doesn't need to have a title to be a very influential and motivating person for people. He's involved principally in the early part of Acts before it switches to Paul. Again, that's because he's on trial, and this is a whole legal brief for his defense. Luke is putting together to Theophilus, who's a magistrate in Rome, who's advising Nero in an upcoming appeal. But that's a whole nother story. All right. So anyway, that's the differences. And I also found it interesting that the ending there is cut out by the commentator completely, Mr. Bray, where he talks about converted from idols to the faith of the one God. So this one God principle was much more obviously well spoken of in the early church. And again, this work is probably between 350 and 370 AD. So there's still there's still a group of people who want to believe there's one God. So there's still a remnant of the original faith, even people who were pro-Paul. All right. Okay, so I just want to show you the book to the left, Patriologiae, where I got the Latin text. Again, it's an 1879 work, and he is a well-regarded, very highly well-regarded scholar in his own right. This guy's saying, we're going to just print whatever is in the manuscripts, and that's it. Boom. And that's what we have today. All right. So I want you to also see this is a side-by-side between the Latin on the right and which is translated by myself with the help of Google Translate. And then on the left is the English translation. Okay. And you can screenshot this. You can read this. Well, actually, I'm going to read just to show you how close Google gets. So I made sure every word was put in exactly as, every word was put exactly as it appears in Patriologiae, and listen to how it came out. Although I am not an apostle to others, yet I am to you, because by the Jews who believed and nevertheless kept the law, he was denied to be an apostle. For he was already teaching that the circumcised should not be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept. But to the rest of the apostles who, because of the scandal, concealed themselves from this matter, he seemed to teach differently. Therefore, the apostle was denied by them, meaning the title of apostle was denied by them. For the apostle was to these who had seen in him signs of virtue. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, for by preaching this they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. Okay, so you can see how it just needs some smoothing out, and it's virtually comes out of Google Translate perfectly. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about Patriologiae, so we provide some fair context that some people criticize it, and I want you to hear what that criticism is. Patriologia Latina is an enormous collection of the writings of the Church Fathers and other ecclesiastical writers published by Jacques-Paul Minier between 1841 and 1855, with indices published between 1862 and 1865. It is also known as the Latin series, as it formed one half of Minier's Patrologiae Cursus Completus, the other part being the Patrologiae Greco-Latina of patristic and medieval Greek works, with their sometimes non-matching medieval Latin translations. Although consisting of reprints of old editions, which often contain mistakes and do not comply with modern standards of scholarship, the series, due to its availability, it is present in many academic libraries, and the fact that it incorporates many texts of which no modern critical edition is available is still widely used by scholars of the Middle Ages, as in this respect comparable to the Monumenta Germanae Historica. Okay, so nobody's perfect. Apparently, he had typos or mistakes from time to time. Although in this text that I saw and I was working on, there was flawless, very well done. And the typography is difficult with Latin. You have special word letters. You know, the A and E have to be sometimes melted together, and all these things. You got it perfectly right. Did a great job. Easily translated to Google Translate. That shows you how excellent his typography, his organization, punctuation, everything was perfect. And so all I have to say is I'm more suspicious of someone who says, I'm going to use textual criticism, which is how the, I'll show you, well, let me see, is the CELS at their Wikipedia webpage, which explains them. They use critical analysis, and I'm very much more suspicious about that when it's unexplained, when they just make the change and they don't tell you we've taken out words that used to be there for centuries, and we just felt it wasn't the way Ambrose would talk, or Ambrose asked her. Okay, so I want to show you a theory I have, which is in Galatians, this same Ambrose will call this episode in Galatians 2:11 a scandal, but he means a scandal against Peter's actions, not Paul over Paul's own actions. So that just goes to show you have to see it from both ways. And here in this is fascinating because on this webpage or website called eCatena, it's a lot like other eCatenas like earlychristianwritings.com, but it's actually much more comprehensive. So I'm very excited. It's just recently come up. Anyway, so here's what Paul says in Galatians 2:11. But when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. All right. Now, when you go to the eCatena for 2:11 with this new eCatena that's out there, it's going to pop up here and it says Clement of Rome around 99 AD writes the following. Now, I want you to know it should really have told you where it got this from, the Clementine homilies. Clementine homilies were not that influential, and they'd all been rewritten, basically destroying their negativity towards Paul by changing Paul's name in 8 different places into Simon Magus, as all reputable scholars have indicated is obviously how it originally read. It originally had Paul in there. And one of the times Paul is being addressed by Peter is the quote right here. See where it says Clement of Rome? So the person speaking is not Clement. Clement is quoting Peter. And I believe this was in the original text, and Peter's addressing Simon Magus, who this is one of the 8 times the scholars agree this is really Peter talking to Paul. So this gives you the other side of the coin. And the reason I bring this up is that's why if we had been told there was a scandal in 1 Corinthians 9:2, and then we could link it up to Galatians 2:11 by the same author, Ambrose Astor, using the same terminology as he did in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2, then we could then start piecing together what's going on here. Is this episode where Peter is rebuked and blamed by Paul, which is very offensive within any culture of an organization, particularly a religious one, where an inferior is trying to talk down to a superior. It's like it's outlandish behavior. You have to be respectful no matter what to someone who's a ruler over you. And incidentally, Paul, when he was in front of the Sanhedrin in his testimony in Acts, he insulted the high priest, and when he was told he's a ruler over you, he says, "Oh my gosh, I forgot. If I didn't," he said, "No, I didn't know it was the high priest. Otherwise, I know there's a law that you're not allowed to insult or curse a ruler over you." Well, what is he doing here? He doesn't have this right to rule. So the basic point is, you cannot rebuke someone who's superior to you inside of an organization. You have to respectfully make your case, but not with no condemnation, with no claim that they should be blamed for anything. And also, Paul wasn't even in the right in this whole case, probably because he was the one advocating it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And Jesus is unequivocal in Revelation 2 twice. He says it's wrong in all cases, no exceptions. Anyway, let's listen to what is the other side of the coin. Here's what is my belief of what's going on here. There is a clear tie between what we read and this message here from Clement of Rome in this E Catena. So Peter's addressing Paul, and Peter says to Paul, "If you were not opposed to me, you would not accuse me and revile the truth proclaimed by me, in order that I may not be believed when I state that I myself have heard with my own ears from the Lord, as if I were evidently a person that was condemned and in bad repute." So do you notice the same words right there, condemned? Well, that's the same words that is blamed here in Galatians 2:11. So it's a clear tie-in. Paul is being answered in the Clementine homilies as they are originally written. And here's the other big clue. When this commentary on Corinthians is written, it's in the 360 to 370 period. Rufinus has not yet destroyed the original Clementine homilies. So when this is written to the audience of Ambrose, his audience would immediately pick up on the fact that, or those who are can read, that the message is about the same episode. That's the scandal. The scandal is the church is still circulating. The original Ebionite church was still circulating that Clementine homilies up until the time Rufinus destroys it and turns it into a romance story and gets rid of Paul's name and puts in Simon Magus and makes it all about a lot of other frivolous things that are in there that don't have anything to do with anything. So that's my theory, that's what we're looking at, and I think there's strong evidence of that. So that's why those words were there. They were to refer to this, and that is why it gives you more confidence that indeed the 12 were addressing something that is actually an incident that's recorded by Paul from his perspective. But if you want to see the other side of the coin, you got to go listen to this quote. And there's more stuff. One of the other important remarks, and it take too long to go through the whole thing, but Peter tells Paul, so as far as Peter knew, that Paul had some sort of vision of Jesus, in the sky, but like not a physical one, but like to himself, like a vision that people sometimes claim when they're sleeping or dreaming or in a trance, they'll perceive they're having a vision. And he said to Paul, he said, "How can you preach what Jesus is teaching when all you've been trained is by a vision?" Whoa, what a blunt put down is that. So that's again in the Clementine homilies. So those are and there's a lot more, and it's really well written. I can't even do it justice by paraphrasing it. So we'll maybe go into that later, but you can see those who are people who are Pauline Christians and you're trying to make a decision. Hey, should I turn back to Christ and just focus there and not follow Mr. Breaker claiming that we just pay attention to Paul? And we'll find out in heaven whether we're right or wrong, because we've done nothing on this earth to listen and follow Jesus because Mr. Breaker says that's wrong. We're not to get our message there that way, and so on. Is that really going to get you to heaven? That, my friends, the answer is no, because you are missing this historical picture of what happened in the early church. And Breaker's being a fan of Paul is a fan of someone who the 12 already rejected. And now we have a clear case of when it happened, why it happened, and it was in the lifetime of the apostles, and Paul was clearly on the outs with them. And that's that gives you another support, because don't you think if the 12 had decided this, that's key? People always tell me, "Oh, does Second Peter speak so nicely of Paul? So don't you think you have to follow what Peter says?" Yes, I do. Generally, I think he's authoritative, but if he didn't see all the epistles of Paul and didn't have this interchange with Paul at the time yet when he wrote Second Peter, well, it kind of moots the whole point. So we know later in time than Second Peter,
Paul was rejected by the 12. So whatever happened earlier when Peter accepted Paul is outweighed by the fact that Peter later rejects Paul unequivocally in these passages, and it's admitted by a fan of Paul. So that you cannot claim this is an enemy of Paul. This is a friend of Paul putting a nice spin on it to say, hey, it's really not a big deal that the 12 did this to Paul and just called him a false apostle and excluded him, because you know what? The people in the pew, they make the decisions, not the apostles, of whether Paul's message is good or bad. And by the way, that is so contrary to the word of God. We don't make the decision. God makes the decision, and he gives us criteria to use to determine why someone is accepted or not into canon. All right. I hope that helps both audiences I was making this video for, those who are making a decision whether to follow Christ anew in a different way than you have been, being dispensationalist or whatever. And I hope you can see following Paul is not the way. And for those who are, our mission is to help reach our family and friends who have been trapped by this false apostle. This is another piece of evidence that you can use to help persuade them.
Okay, that'll end this episode. This hopefully gives you an idea of what is the gist of that entire video. If you want to listen to the entire video, a link will be in the description to this video. Thank you, everyone. God bless.